So, hi everybody, I'm Tom Wild from ProWritingAid. Thank you for joining us for yet another session of Ask a Book Doctor, our Ask a Book Doctor series. And as usual, I'm joined by Sally OJ. How are you doing, Sally?
I'm doing great, Tom, thanks. It's lovely, as you said, very spring-like. You know what, before we start, I just wanted to say I had a look at the video of last month's session, and I was horrified to hear myself saying you don't want to get done for slander. Now, as all of you out there know, when you write something bad, it's libel. It's not slander. Slander is when you talk about somebody. So I just need to correct myself there. Nobody wants to get done for libel. And I'm very much looking forward to today's talking about fantasy.
Great, fantastic. So thanks.
I'm sorry, it really bothered me when I saw it, so I thought I have to correct it.
It's just your hidden perfectionist, Sal. Okay, let's get right into this, because tonight we're talking about fantasy, and it's a really hot topic for us, having done Fantasy Week recently. So that's why we thought it would be a good time to, cover this topic in a Ask a Book Doctor series 2. I want to know, Sal, I want to start by asking how you feel when a fantasy novel or manuscript arrives in your inbox.
Well, it's a mixture of emotions, because I love fantasy as a genre. I really enjoy reading fantasy. But the first thing I always think is, oh, I hope this is going to bring something new. I hope this is going to bring something fresh, because I feel that in my 25 odd years of doing this, I have really read the same sort of fantasy quest novel 5 or 6 or 7 times. Obviously not literally. I mean, in terms of, it's very, very easy to get sort of stuck in the tropes of the genre and to not bring anything fresh. And so that is always my first thought, a mixture of sort of pleasant anticipation and genuine sort of, well, anxiety would be much too strong a word, but genuine sort of apprehension that I will be reading the same old.
Okay, and actually let's just pause right there, because it'd be great to know from our joiners tonight, who out there is working on a fantasy novel right now. Is it your first or your second or your third? And do you, I'd love to know where what you get stuck with, where you are at the moment, what you're finding difficult. And Sal, so while those questions come in, what is it that marks, that we all know some fantastic fantasy novels, we can all reel kind of many off. What makes them stand out? So what is, where do they go right and where do many kind of go wrong?
So in case I forget you asked that, do remember what you just asked me. There's a very clear answer to that, I think, but first we have to go back a little bit and talk about the genre.
Okay.
And almost more than any other genre, I think fantasy has got, the readers of fantasy fiction know exactly what they want, and there are very clear tropes that they're going to get a bit cheesed off if they don't get. So what a writer of a fantasy novel has to do is walk this very, very thin line between giving readers exactly what they want, which they've read 100 times before, but they still want it, and bringing something new and fresh and great that will really. So I do remember what you asked me, which is something of a first. So with the greats, and just pulling some out of thin air, well, obviously, if you start with The Hobbit, nobody had really seen anything like that before, so that was all fresh. But if you think about Philip Pullman, he's got the demons. If you think about my mind's gone blank. Oh no, look, quick, I wrote some down. And McCafferty's got the dragons. Obviously Game of Thrones has got this huge all these different sort of quests all rolled into one big quest. So I mean, actually Game of Thrones, what leans more into the second thing that I was going to say. So the first thing is bringing something that nobody's seen before into it, if you look at all the really big ones. But then it's also to do, and this is where Harry Potter comes in very strongly, it comes down to the small details. When you're building a world, when you're building a new world, a different world, it's great to have the rolling plains and the snow-capped mountains and the mines and the forests and all of that. And it's often very important because they're nearly always quest novels. These, they say that there's five, or different people say different things, 5 or 7 different kinds of plot. And one of the most well-known ones is the quest. And fantasy novels are nearly always quest novels. Yep. So you need this broad picture, but the ones that people really love are the ones that get the small details right. And J.K. Rowling, say what you like about her, is the absolute queen of this. That every detail's down to the furniture, the cutlery, every single detail is fresh and new and interesting and pulls the reader right in there into that world. If you go back to The Hobbit, he also does this. He creates this very, through Bilbo and the way Bilbo reacts to things, you get this very sort of specific world that people get very drawn into. And for me, when I'm working on a fantasy novel, this is one of the things that I'm really looking for, is the small detail that really pulled us in. And funnily enough, one of the things I often get sort of frustrated by is when people write about food, because there's when people write about fantasy, there is this pull towards, and it's very understandable, because you basically want a world without technology very often. Yeah. So there's a pull towards the kind of medieval, or there's a pull towards something that's vaguely ancient Chinesey or vaguely ancient Japanesey, or this kind of thing. Evolved civilizations, but without technology, basically. But for some reason, so many authors that I have worked with, when they come to food in their books, it's always very, very simple food. And even if it's a big feast, it's very, very simple feast. They have a roasted ox, or they have thin gruel, or they have and I read a trilogy years ago by a writer called Elizabeth A. Lynn. I don't know if anyone has read any of her books. I think they're called The Chronicles of Tornor. And one of the things that absolutely knocked me out about her books, I mean, everything about it, but it was this creation of this completely, it was the same world, but it was completely different. You could recognize them as humans. You could recognize the world they're walking through, but it was completely different. And she really, I don't know whether she's a foodie in real life, but she really went to town with the food. And as wide a variety of food as we would have now, nothing obviously takeaway or bought in paper bags, but all the different snack foods that people could buy on the street. As she moved the location, the food got different. So as she went from the mountains to the sea, the food got different. It's small things like that which are huge, really huge, because you think, this is a real world. I'm right in here. And I do recommend, I had a look on Amazon just before we came on tonight, and to my sadness, her books are available on Amazon in the UK and in the States, but only on Kindle, The Chronicles of Tornor, the trilogy. And they are really a masterclass in doing this. I'm sure everyone listening will have their own, they'll say, I found that with this book or that book. But so that was a very long answer to your question.
No, an interesting one, and be interesting to know if anyone listening or joining us tonight has read any of Elizabeth A. Lynn's work. I mean, what you've said, Sal, is certainly resonating with our joiners. So, just mentioning the word, fresh and details. Those are things that stood out to me.
Do
and
you
that's been mentioned by, you know, people have mentioned exactly that in
yeah. Do you want to I can't do it. Do you want to put in the chat?
I'm slightly
Elizabeth
worried about
Lynn.
Elizabeth. Is it yeah, hang on.
So Elizabeth and then initial A and then LYNN.
Right.
And the trilogy, I think, is called The Chronicles of Tornor, TORNOR. Yeah, there you go. Somebody's just, that's so weird. I don't usually see.
There we go.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's our first recommendation for
the evening. They are wonderful. I mean, I think they are. People might not like them at all. This is the thing about fantasy. You find your sort of groove, and it's a huge genre, and you can find the sort of story you like, and you can just stick with those stories and never venture anywhere else in the genre, you know, and that's fine. That's good.
Yeah, it's interesting. And for me, it's not, you know, it actually isn't my genre. It's not a genre that I really read much of, but it's an interesting one. And I really I'm interested by the idea that why we read fantasy and the point you made about the kind of, you crave almost like a simpler
world. Yeah,
a simpler world. That's what you said.
A simpler world. I think people, I mean, this is just my observation. We may get a shower of people disagreeing, but I think one of the reasons people love fantasy so much is it's a world that they can put themselves in, and it's absolutely, I mean, in their imagination, and it's removed completely from anything. And it does tend to be a simpler world. I mean, I say that if you take Philip Pullman again, it's fantastically complicated, obviously, but in some ways, fantasy is usually a sort of stripped back world, a simpler world, less technology, and sort of like I said, there's this. I've had a lot of books that have got sort of tinges of ancient or what they. I don't think they're meaning to write about ancient China, but sort of tinges of that kind. Like I said, a very sophisticated civilization, but very simple in many ways. This seems to appeal to people a lot, and I understand why. It appeals to me as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
When we were talking, sorry, Tom.
That's okay.
You got them on a roll now. When we were talking earlier in the week, I mentioned Star Trek, didn't I? The very first series of Star Trek, which obviously everyone's going to be saying, no, the Star Trek is sci-fi. But I think the first series of Star Trek easily comes under fantasy as well. For reasons I could go on about.
Let's wait for the reaction. Come on, listeners.
Outrage.
What do you think?
Outrage.
First series was sci-fi or fantasy? What do you think? But okay. And why was that, Sal?
Because it's this very safe, very ordered world, all happening on the Starship Enterprise. Everyone's got their place. You've even got their right colors to know who everyone is. It's very calm, and it's completely different, but it's the same. You know, down to Uhuru being on reception on the deck, and you know they go down into these different worlds, but it's not like usually great big battles. I mean, it is sometimes battles with spaceships and stuff. I know it is. I know it straddles sci-fi as well, obviously, but I think it is also fantasy.
Yeah.
The first TV series or incarnation of Star Trek.
And so when we talked about historical fiction, we talked a lot about the research that goes into historical fiction. And what does that look like for fantasy? So is it just a case, you know, of reading voraciously? I
really do think that is, you can do research for writing a fantasy novel, and that's reading good fantasy novels and identifying for yourself what is making you so entranced with it.
Yeah.
You know, that's it's seeing. Most people, let's face it, most people who write a fantasy novel love to read fantasy novels, and it's thinking about what you love about it. Why do you love it? What is it that makes you want to read these books, and what is it that delivers in these books? What is it that you find in these books that make you, not want to put it down, want to read the next one in the trilogy? And this is another thing. Fantasy is a great genre for, book one, book two, book three, book 7, book 12. Great one for series.
And actually, this is a lovely segue into me just kind of giving a shout out to everyone that's put in chat what they're working on, because we've had, I don't know, 20, 25 people saying what they're working on. And that includes people finishing a trilogy, working on 2, someone working on the first, me, 4th book in a series. And some great comments in there, things that you're struggling with, talking about. We had some comments about kind of setting the scenes, characterization,
Absolutely.
endings.
Yeah, all of those things. And it is knowing the tropes. There are these very definite fantasy tropes, often a quest, but people want, a different world. People want, nearly always want an outsider as your main protagonist. You're someone who's been hard done by, somebody who starts the book, Harry Potter, starts the book at a disadvantage. There are very, very, I've forgotten her name in the Philip Pullman books, Ilaria, something like that. I'm sorry, I've forgotten. But you can
help you out there.
You can go through them all, and there's usually a sort of a loner, a misunderstood loner who sets out on the quest, and it all sort of comes good. Of course, first it goes bad, but then it all comes good.
Yeah.
And the trick with, once you've learnt the tropes, and I think actually if you read a lot of fantasy, you just know them, sort of automatically, is to then do what I was saying earlier, is to turn them on their head a bit, play with them, bring a new twist, give a new twist to them, because although readers want the same thing, they also want something different. And that's why it's very difficult to really deliver a sort of eye-catching fantasy book.
Okay.
Because you've got to, I'm just repeating myself as I always do endlessly, but you've got this very fine balance between what the reader expects and playing with their expectations and turning things on their head. I mean, recently, there's been this many books that turn the sort of helpless maiden trope on its head, and the helpless maiden becomes the warrior or the instigator or the solver of the problems, or that. I mean, that's now quite a well-worn trope. But this is the kind of thing you want to do. You want to sort of play around with the tropes of the genre and breathe some pink into its cheeks.
Okay. Now, you mentioned something there, Sal, which was about balance. It's a fine balance. And that must also apply with, you talk about detail, but in fact, I noticed one of the comments in chat where I think Starseeker 1978 was saying, I have a challenge setting my scene. It's either too much or too little as I focus on the characters. So that must be again, it's a fine line, right?
It is. It's always a fine line, and that's the same with description always. The thing, what you want to do is, this is what J.K. Rowling is so good at. Whatever you think of her as a writer, and I actually think very highly of her as a writer, which I know is quite controversial. She's not a great writer in the literal sense, but she's not as fantastic writer in the literal sense, but in the world that she creates, that oh God, why do I always do this? Why have I forgotten? What am I talking about, Tom?
J.K. Rowling.
No, before that, what was I going to say that was very good about her?
We were talking about the balance of the balance between too much and too little detail.
That's right. I'm sorry. I am sorry, people. I'm sorry.
That's why I'm here, Sally.
It is, thank God. You're my external hard drive, Tom. That she just gives you this world. At no point does she explain anything. At no point does she. I mean, you do have Ron explaining things to Harry or whatever, but essentially it's just there. He gets on the train to go to Hogwarts, and all the suites are different. Everything's different, and she doesn't. It's just there. The world is just there.
Yeah.
And that is the trick, really, to not sort of spend ages writing out this really sort of, not to spend ages describing the world to people, just letting it be there. Just let your characters walk through it and eat the food and see the things and, you know, smoke the stuff or you know, whatever they're doing.
Yeah.
And let it just sort of introduce itself as the book comes along. That's what J.K. Rowling is really, really good at. And what you know, if you go back, you know, down through the, you know, from The Hobbit to Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe and all of them, you know, that's what they're very, very, very good at doing. You just step into the world. So in answer to the question, yes, I've been talking about give us all the small details, but not in a, you know, it's just like, instead of he picked up the bread and cheese, he picked up the, you know, Elizabeth A. Lynn, I always remember one of the food stuff she described, she just makes up, is something called a noodle pie. I know that always stuck with me. So instead of, you know, picking up the hunk of bread and cheese, which you always get, somebody picks up a noodle pie. So it's just
immediately picture it as well.
Yes, exactly. So
Yeah.
it's not somebody saying, oh, this is a noodle pie, it's made like this and it tastes like that. It's just, you know, slid in there, and that's when it works really well. I hope that did answer the question.
Yeah, it does. And I think Daryl sums it up in chat where he says, let the reader's imagination riff rather than clobbering them with detailed exposition.
Certainly not exposition. Detail is good, but it's balance.
Yeah.
The more you can pull somebody into the world, the better it is. But you don't want to hammer it. You don't want to bang on. You know, you don't want somebody to take 20 minutes to walk across the room because you're telling us all the fine details. It's much better that they walk into the room, sit down and pick up the noodle pie and take a bite. You know, then we know we're not in Kansas anymore.
Great. So we've got some questions already coming in. Do add your questions. I know there are some questions kind of going into chat. That's fine. But I'm just keeping an eye on the ones in the Q&A box as well. So let's go through a couple of those, Sal, and we can come back to, I know we've got a few more things to go through too, but one of our joiners says, I was told that 9 POVs are too many. I'm wondering if they confused protagonist with POV.
9 POVs is an awful lot. So I mean, honestly, obviously I haven't seen the book.
Yeah.
And you might be pulling it off brilliantly, but 9 is a lot, and it's a lot. As with everything when we talk in these sessions, the first thing that you have to think about when you're writing is your reader. You have to think about your reader. They want to enjoy this book. They don't want to have to work. They don't want to have to make notes in the margins so they can remember who's who. They want to just, I've said it before, glide down the river of your story. They don't want to worry about the oars going overboard. So think of your reader's comfort. If you've got 9 points of view, to me, that suggests too many. But you might be pulling it off brilliantly. So
they've just explained, actually, they have a team of superheroes with the storylines intertwined.
So that might work very well. What is vital is clarity for the reader. That's what you've got to think about. So rather than, you know, you've got this story in your head with these superheroes, which is probably great, but your reader is coming to it stone cold. They have got no idea about any of it. So you have to make sure that your reader knows where you are. It's good to give, if you've got 9 points of view, it's very good. I mean, it's good if you've got 2 points of view, 3, to be honest, but to give each person something identifiable, which presumably you have if they're superheroes, just really focus on making sure that your reader isn't going to get lost, isn't going to have to go back and search for something, or isn't going to feel that they've missed something when they haven't. That's important. That it's very important, because if there's too much, if it's too much hard work, you've lost your reader. They're not, people don't read books to suffer.
Yeah.
They read books for pleasure.
So I'm not sure, interesting on this one. So what would you recommend should we add to our fantasy world if the setting is current time and the fantasy being moves within human society?
Yeah,
so they've said I added normal human events like weddings and funerals, but I created specialized rituals and items.
That's brilliant, because that's our world, but it's not. So somebody's put, if I don't want to suffer, we wouldn't read. I would say rather, if you don't want to suffer, you wouldn't write, actually. But setting something, I told you, Tom, I recently worked on a book very like that, was set now, but it wasn't. It was now, it was here, but it wasn't. It was just, certain things were very different. That's great, go for it.
Yeah.
But then you've got to, in a way, if you start with a blank sheet, it's easier for you to create a world. If you're reconstructing our world, which is what Pullman does, of course, to a degree, you've got a lot of work on your plate. But if you can do it and you can pull it off, fantastic, absolutely.
Yeah, great. Fred Berry, a regular contributor, asks, isn't there a subgenre under fantasy, i.e. romance, sci-fi, etc.? I mean,
there's a huge Venn diagram between fantasy and sci-fi, and people will argue about different books. What did I write down before? Stephen King. Some people will say Stephen King is fantasy. Most people will say he's horror. So that's just an argument to go on. With subgenres, they are endless. In fantasy, absolutely endless. And this is what I was sort of touching on before. You find the stuff you like. It's a huge genre, fantasy, huge and broad and exciting and interesting, and with a huge readership, and people usually find the kind of stuff they like and don't ever have to really stray out of it often. So yes, you can do a romance or sci-fi. The point where where a book stops being fantasy or starts being sci-fi or vice versa is very nebulous, actually. We all think we know it, but everyone's got a slightly different take, I think.
I'm sure. Okay, next question. So this is from Laurie Busk at Gmail. I had some beta readers tell me they got lost in all the backstory of my character. How can I include what the reader needs to know, but continue to move the story forward? So what's your advice?
So this is, again, with fantasy, the danger of exposition is huge, because you've got to give them, this is what I was talking about J.K. Rowling. She doesn't explain any of it. You just walk into it. You just walk into the world and things pop up. And there's a little bit at the beginning of Harry Potter where Ron, I think, explains things to Harry, but generally, you're just walking through it. The same with The Hobbit. You're just walking through it and things happen. There is this huge temptation to give the backstory. There is this huge temptation to explain the world and how it works. But if you can, certainly with the first draft, I would say just write the story. Don't bother giving all this exposition. Don't give information dumps. None of that. Just write the story. Just get your protagonist from A to B to C to D. Go on your Freytag's pyramid of a journey. And when that's all in place, you will find the places that, you might want to do a prologue. That's very common in fantasy books. You might want to have the first chapter and then a sort of little journey, sort of sideline chapter, which explains some things. Or you might want to just, when the story is all written, you might just think, yeah, I can just now introduce the aspects of this world into it, and it will be fine. I don't have to, the story's done, so I don't have to sort of hammer everything in. It's a really hard one, because if you're creating a world from scratch, of course you want your reader to know exactly what you're doing, and you want your reader to understand what you're doing, but less is usually more.
That always seemed to me, with the fantasy that I have read, a thing that just makes my mind boggle. The way an author creates a world from scratch and draws you into it. And it wasn't Tolkien used to actually. I mean, he used to draw his own maps and things, didn't he? I know.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and he created a whole language, Elvish. I think maybe there was more than one. People here will know, but what you have to do is all the most successful fantasy novels, they don't explain, or at least not really, and the readers get that. The readers know that they're going to be very confused for the first chapter or so, but they trust it's all going to work out. Yeah. And you go into reading a fantasy book or a sci-fi book with that sort of leap of faith, so you can get away with not sort of shoveling the detail, the backstory in, as long as the reader gets what they need to know as the story unfolds. That's the important thing. Yeah. For some reason, that made me think, I don't know why, of something else that we were talking about the other day, that when you're creating your world, now this is a personal bugbear of mine. Everyone here might love this, but I find it, my heart sinks, and that is the use of the apostrophe when it comes to names or place names and things like that. We all know T'Pau was a character in Star Trek. I think it was Spock's mother, was she? But T''Pow. And fantasy writing absolutely bristles with apostrophes, names like T'Pau, Katong, Bading, Badang, these, and that has been done to death. So everyone here is going, my novel is full of, it's fine. If it's what you like, if it's what tells you this is a fantasy novel, that's great. And it is a challenge to come up with different names all the time. Of course it is. But something in my heart sort of quails a bit if I see loads of names and place names that are all with the apostrophes. This was something that was started in the 60s, maybe even before, and it's very, I don't want to say old, but it's been done now. So I would urge people away from that. But that's just it. That really is just me. That's my personal.
Well, no, but that's what these sessions are about. It's getting your take as a book doctor, as an editor. So it's really
and a despot.
Yeah, be good to know. Good to hear what people think. So another question, Sal. Although my novel is not a genre fantasy novel, it involves a character who time travels to Paris in 1866. How do you write about a contemporary person and their disbelief in finding themselves in this unusual environment without a lot of repetition?
Good question. Very good question. Yes, because they would just be walking around going, what the hell? Oh, yes. My God, what, that smells horrible. That tastes disgusting. I can smell BO. Yes, it's true. You just have to dial it right down. You need it there because otherwise it's unrealistic. But you just have to, I always say to people, a novel is not real life. Real life is really boring. Or if, in this case, if you wrote it realistically, it would just be a lot of repetition, and it would be very wearing after a while. But you must have your character stunned and shocked and taken aback. So you just have to dial it down several notches. Yeah. And you can, I'm sure, you can give a page or two of complete, spinning bewilderment, but then dial it down. I would say. But excellent question.
Great, thanks, Sal. I love Gabrielle's comment about going back to names and apostrophes. So she says, I love making up names. I pick a language I like the sound of then put words into Google Translate and take bits from each.
Perfect. And you know,
Oh.
Tom, is that not exactly what we were talking about the other day?
Yes.
That is exactly the kind of thing I advise people to do. Absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
That is using your imagination. And this is one of the things about fantasy. It lets people be lazy. Not you, the person who's just done that. It was a brilliant
It's not
idea.
you, Gabrielle.
Not you, Gabrielle. But it really does let people be lazy. They just go with the groove of it. And one of the real challenges of writing good fantasy is really stretching your imagination. People think, well, I've done that. I've created a whole new world. But you've got to really keep your imagination going. You've got to really push yourself creatively. You've got to push against these walls of these tropes and really think, I hate this expression, but think outside the box. I didn't say that, forget I said it. But you've really got to push and struggle and pull yourself out of the sort of your head above the clouds of it and start thinking more originally. And that's really brilliant, what Gabrielle just said. And it's very much, Gabrielle, Tom and I were talking about what I advise people to do only the other day, and it very, very, very similar kind of thing. Fantastic. Well done.
Excellent. Okay, let's have another question. Daryl, you're a regular contributor too. I'm having trouble not making my main character a late teens male. I didn't set out to write YA, but the story works best if I have him start at this point. Is there a way of making him late 20s without him having transforming experiences before setting out on his quest?
Yes. And this is going to sound really rude, and I don't mean it to be rude. That's what writing is. You've got to find a reason for that. If he's in his late 20s and he hasn't had those experiences, you've got to provide a reason why. You have got to, as a writer, you've got to know why, and you've got to help the reader to understand why. And that is what being a writer is. You have to come up with, and I know you're going to say, yes, I know, that's what I was asking you. Fair enough. But you need to sit with that character for a day or two or a week or 6 weeks and find out why he hasn't had those experiences. If it makes it easier to make him older, that's great. Then you have to take the story with that. You have
Sorry, what you're saying there about sitting with the character, I love that expression. So that the point being, you just need to let these things stew over and be present in your mind and kind of focus on them and think about them.
You have to, brainstorming is really good. And this is something that I do a lot with my authors. And one of the things that I do a lot is I get very excited and I say, I know what you've got to do. You've got to do this. If you do this, it's going to solve everything. And half the time, my author will say, no, I'm not going to do that. But you saying that has made me realize what I do have to do. You've sort of pushed the door open a little bit. So if you're in a writing group, or if you have got friends that, it's a big ask of your friends, but if you've got people or a partner who hasn't divorced you yet because you're always talking about your book, then, say to them, I've been, how can I get him? What would have happened? What might have happened to him? And your partner will say, well, I think he's been locked in a cupboard for the last 40 years. And you'll say, no, that can't be it. But the locking thing, that's quite good. I quite like. So it's a process. And your book will really benefit for it if it's really well thought out. Your book will benefit from it so much. So the really simple and sarcastic sounding but not sarcastic meaning answer is you have to write it. You have to be a writer and you have to write it.
I love that though, about it's the exploring it with others as well that can trigger things. And actually Anjean says writing groups are a great incubator.
They are. They're fantastic. I mean, they're not everyone's cup of tea, but if you are predisposed to joining a writing group, they're wonderful. The thing is, there's this really popular misconception of a writer sort of in a garret, with the deal table and the foolscap paper and all of that and the scratchy pen. No successful writer has done it on their own. I guarantee you. You look at the acknowledgements in the back of any printed book. There are sometimes pages of acknowledgements, and these are all people who have, well, obviously some of them are doing sort of very literal jobs like the publisher or whatever, but mostly it's people who have helped with research, or people have had conversations with, or people who have brainstormed with, or people who have contributed in some way to the book. No author should go through writing it. A book will suffer if you don't talk to other people. It will suffer. Get your writing buddies around you, get your writing homies around you. It will make a tremendous difference.
I love this suggestion, Sal, from, bear with me, Laurie, who says, interview your character and it will make you see them differently and force you to think about who they are.
Absolutely.
And then the next person, and then the next comment, I think Star Seeker again, yeah, putting myself in their shoes. How would I be, or how would I react if this
absolutely. You remember when we did characterization, I talked about writing at least 2 or 3 pages about each character. Not that you have to put it in the book, but just stuff about, you know, he doesn't like mushrooms and his middle name is Tathao, and he, you know, he's a Gemini and he likes you know, fish or whatever. Just shove it all in there, everything you can think about him. You're not going to put it all in the book, but it will inform your idea of him, or her, I should say, and it will make a tremendous difference, because that stuff will come out on the page somehow. You're not going to write all that stuff into the book, but you are going to have a scene where somebody offers him a dish of mushrooms and he goes, no thanks. And it just make it a bit more realistic, you know.
So I'm just going to try and get through a couple more questions because time is ticking on. Teresa asks, I have a group of characters that are just basically elders. How do I differentiate those when they don't actually have names?
So the first thing, and Teresa, please don't be demoralized by this, is, you know, elders, big trope. So you've really got to bring something different to them. You know, this is one of the things I see all the time in fantasy books, is there is a group of elders. I've just worked on a really good fantasy book, and there was the sort of faceless elders who sort of presided over everything. So if you want them to stand out as individuals, you have them say something, you give them often physical characteristics, but you have to think, why are they, the thing is, why are they there? What is the reason you have put these elders into the book? What is their purpose in your story? Does there need to be that many of them? If there does have to be that many of them, what are you giving your reader with these elders? So get right down into the belly of them, right down into the sinew and the muscle of them. Work out why they're there, work out what you're trying to tell your reader with them, and make sure that they deliver that. And again, not meaning this sarcastically, I'm just very worried it'll come across as sarcastically. Your job as a writer is then to write that, to find out what they're doing there and give that to the reader. So it's very easy to think, we've got this society and there will be a group of elders and they will have this. So that's such a familiar trope. By all means, go with it. I don't mean to distress you. Go with them. But what are you saying with them? What is fresh with them? What is their purpose, and how are they interacting with the rest of the story and your protagonist? That's what you've got to think about.
Yeah. Anyone who's not kind of got chat open at the moment, I really recommend it, because as well as listening into what Sally's explaining, there's some great conversations going on here and great suggestions of things to do to help you really get under the skin or into the mind of a character that I think is really interesting. So Barb's talked about giving characters a birth date allows you to use some characteristics of the zodiac sign, whether you believe in them or not. Great idea, says Shirley.
Absolutely. As I just said, always give them a birthday. Seriously, always give your characters a birthday. And you know, make them real to yourself. You know when their birthday is, you know that can find its way into the book in all sorts of ways. And yes, if you believe in astrology, or if you don't believe in astrology, you can give. I've worked on several books where all the characters are very clearly belong to different signs of the zodiac. It's not ever really it's not explained or driven home, but this writer was very into astrology and made all their characters very clearly Scorpios and Geminis and Tauruses and so on. And they were very, you know, and it worked really well actually, because she had a very clear sense of how they were. So yeah, but any little details, eye color, you know, just seriously everything
So,
that you can chuck in there.
interesting question. I think it's from Paul Draper, and he's apologized for not being able to make this much shorter, but bear with me on this. So I'm planning a fantasy trilogy that expands in scale from an English village setting to the wider world. I'm aiming for 5 or 6 central characters, starting with one protagonist who is us, a wide-eyed outsider. Do you recommend introducing this many central characters gradually? I fear that if I start with 6 chapters from 6 different perspectives, that the reader won't know whose story it is. Is that important?
Right. So do not start with 6 chapters.
Okay, there's
from
your
6
answer.
people's perspective. Introduce people gradually.
Okay.
Draw the reader into the story with your main protagonist, and then, you know, again, think of the Hobbit. I'm sorry to go on about, you know, we start with Bilbo. We're very secure. We know who Bilbo is. Then Gandalf arrives. We know who Gandalf is. He's you know, introduced perfectly. And then all the dwarves turn up, but the dwarves are, you know, they've got these names that, you know, so just gently. And the other thing I have to say is, again, very, very familiar tropes you're mentioning there. No harm in it. I'm not trying to make you feel bad or put you off. But, you know, when you said a small English village and then going out into the wider world, you know, that it could be The Hobbit. You're going to go, no, it's not. It's nothing like The Hobbit. And I'm sure it isn't. And you say an outsider, you know, so it's what I was already talking about. Now, this is fine because this is what people want. It is what people want, but just make sure, you know, I'm going to say that you bring something a bit fresh, a bit different into it. Really push yourself, really challenge yourself, make the reader think what you want the reader to think is, oh, this is new.
Yeah.
I haven't read this before. This is great. You know, this didn't go where I thought it was going to go at all. This is fantastic. I wonder what happens next. That's what you want your reader to think.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think probably got time for one more question. Actually, this is quite straightforward. When the character walks into a world, can you explain what they see? That's a really...
I'm going to go back to it's your job as a writer again. Yes, of course you can explain what they see. Just don't get, you know, again, if you go, but I always say this in all of our sessions, look at your favorite books, but look how it's done in your favorite books. It's there, but it's not sort of really shoved in your face, you know? So of course you can. Yes, just do it with a light touch. I mean, even if it's fire-breathing dragons ripping people apart, still do it with a light touch. I know that sounds weird.
Great. Sal, we're coming up to kind of 5 to the hour, so we kind of need to draw it to a close. So is there anything we haven't covered that, you know, obviously you and I talked about this earlier in the week.
Well, I can sum up. So
go for it.
Try and turn the tropes on their head a bit, or inside out, or play with them. Small details really make your world vivid and help your readers come into them. Use your imagination, as we were just saying, not just to create your world, but to make your story feasible and real and different and fresh. You know, the challenge with fantasy is beyond just creating your world. It's to deliver a good story. Make sure that your characters are complex, you know, not just your misunderstood girl who nobody sees. I mean, that's good, that's a brilliant start, but you know, very often in fantasy, the protagonists are very one-dimensional. They are good, but nobody understands that they're good, but they are good. And if you can give your characters a few flaws, that's really helpful. Let them make mistakes. I've said it before when we're talking about characterization. Readers like their protagonists like weebles. They like them to wobble, but not really fall down. So, rough up your characterization a bit and make sure, this is something we haven't even talked about today, make sure you get depth in your writing. Make sure that your writing is textured and uses the right language and uses the right descriptions and use your metaphor, use your simile. That's really important as well. All of this will enrich the world and enrich the writing and pull your reader in.
Thank you, Sal. As we draw it to an end, I just wanted to say a big thank you to everyone who's joined this evening. We really appreciate it. It's so important that we are a kind of community where you, the writers, are helping one another and sharing ideas. I can see that happening in chat right now. And it's fantastic to see that. I hope we help inspire people. I hope we help people tackle some of their challenges and unblock their flows sometimes. And if you do have questions that you haven't thought of tonight and you'd like to send in, please do. You can contact Sally and myself through our Twitter feeds, through email. I obviously work at ProWritingAid, so you can contact me through support channels at ProWritingAid. But for tonight, that's about all we've got time for. Next month, we will be covering beginnings and endings, I think, Sal?
Yeah. I think that's the idea. Thanks so much, everyone. As always, you are the people that make these sessions work with your questions and your interest, and it's just fantastic. Thanks so much. And remember, libel, not slander. Very important.
Fantastic. So thanks ever so much for your time again, Sally. Thank you to everyone out there. We'll see you in April. Oh my goodness me. Have a lovely rest of your day.